So if you look historically at the way drugs are developed, they go through a whole series of phases of clinical development, of trials, where you build the evidence, the clinical evidence, the body of evidence that allows you to seek marketing approval with the regulators. This is significantly challenging with a precision medicine product, particularly when you're looking at potentially very, very small segments, very, very small sort of populations of highly selected patients. So the usual methods that we use for developing a drug are not necessarily applicable. So the session has covered some of those challenges. We split it up into what we think are the key areas people would be interested in. So a little bit from me as to what are the challenges from a drug development perspective. It's about understanding the range of targets we need to try and develop a drug to, the huge complexity and dynamic complexity in treating sort of cancer patients, and then how you go about designing the clinical trials and generating the evidence that will support potential registration of a drug. We moved on then and had a presentation from Philip, who talked about the complexity of data. We can generate a lot of very, very high density data on tumours and on patients, but what do we do with that? How do we understand it? What do we understand is important or relevant? How do we make decisions on that? We then had a talk from Shirley Hopper from the MHRA, who was explaining the routes that we can bring these kinds of data sets together for a discussion with the regulator, and talk through a couple of examples of how the regulators are helping us take on this problem. And finished off with Andrew Bianchi, my co-chair, who comes from the academic sector, who was talking about the real-world problems and challenges of developing these kinds of therapies and how you actually run clinical trials. Not in the the pure world of pharma companies and clinical trials that way, but the reality of patients in the clinic. So a normal clinical trial would take patients selected by a few characteristics, and they're usually quite large populations, and then you go through stages of the usual experimentation with control groups. The challenge with a precision medicine product is that they're very often very, very small segments. So for example, it might be 1 or 2% of a particular type of lung cancer. So you've got various operational challenges about how you find those patients in the first place. How do you get enough of them to be able to run a suitably sized clinical trial to answer the questions? And there are many other sort of technical issues with, for example, understanding the prognostic significance of the marker that you've used to select patients. So typically you can think of very, very much smaller trials, single-arm trials, with a lot of unknowns. So you're dealing with a lot more complexity, a lot more unknowns, so it's harder to interpret the data and control for all of those factors. Then you need to build it at scale and in sufficient numbers to really understand what's going on. So there are a lot of both technical and clinical and operational challenges. I think we've concluded that it's difficult and it's complex, and we knew that previously. I think the real sort of wins in recent years of tackling this is how, as a collective community, we come together to try and solve these problems. So, developing these drugs is not the sole remit of a pharmaceutical company. We actually need to work in partnership and collaboration with academics, with the regulators, with sort of national level and international level initiatives to tackle these problems, and that's really what we're doing. So the conclusion is pretty much, we understand the difficulty, we understand the complexity more than we did before. We're finding practical solutions to deal with it. We've got some examples now that we can test the systems and really sort of figure out what's viable, and we're working very closely as a community across all sectors to try and solve this problem.